Corrie ten Boom was a woman in her late middle age living in Holland during World War II. She lived with her older sister Betsy and their very elderly father. They watched with horror as the Nazis took over Germany. And when the Nazis came into Holland, these two elderly sisters and their very old father decided as Christians that they had to help. And so they began harboring Jews. They had a little secret room in their house, a hiding place. And they would smuggle these Jews into their home, and then eventually they would try to get them out of the country to freedom. And they did this for a period of years, and they helped many, many Jews to escape. But one day, the Nazis came for them. And I always remember this part of the story especially. Corrie had the flu the day the Nazis came. She was deathly ill. And I don't know how many of you have ever had the flu and felt like nothing could ever be worse than this. But if the Nazis came, it would be worse. And pick that moment to drag you out into the street and send you to the concentration camp. And that night was the last time they ever saw their father. He was shipped to a different camp. And the two sisters, by the grace of God, were able to be together. And through their tremendous love for God, they were able even to help in the concentration camp itself. Corrie's sister, Betsy, was very saintly, and she was also very fragile in her health. And so she didn't survive. She passed away right before the Allies came and liberated the camp. Corrie lived, and after she was released, she wrote a book called The Hiding Place. You can read that book if you'd like to. It's beautiful. And she spent the remainder of her life traveling all over the world, talking about love and forgiveness. And it was her custom at the end of one of her lectures to greet people by shaking their hands. And so a big queue of people at every place she went would want to come and shake her hand. One day, at the end of this lecture, she saw people queued up across the room, and she saw there in the back was a former Nazi guard who had been in the camp. In fact, he was one of the ones responsible for the death of her sister. And here she'd been talking about forgiveness and love. And she saw him and she just felt cold hatred grip her heart. And she thought, God, how can I forgive this person? And immediately going through her mind, because she had studied the scriptures, because she had hung on to them as a lifeline in her life, she remembered, we all know this, the Our Father prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those, our debtors. And she remembered that unless we can open our hearts to forgive other people, God's grace can't come into us to forgive us. So she knew these things, and as she was greeting people and shaking hands and seeing this man getting closer and closer. She was going through this in her mind, and she was praying, God, you have to help me forgive this person. I can't do it. And she writes, this coldness had gripped her heart, and she said, but forgiveness is an act of the will. And the will still functions no matter what the temperature of the heart. I love that. And so she was negotiating with God. Okay, so here's what I can do. I can lift my hand to shake this person's hand, but you have to provide the feeling of forgiveness. And so when this man came to stand in front of her, he said, Fräulein ten Boom, I have come because I have become a Christian since the war, and I've realized how many horrible things that I did. And I've come to ask your forgiveness. Can you forgive me? And she's still cold hatred in her heart. But she lifts her hand and she grasps this man's hand. And she said she felt a current of healing flowing through her body into her outstretched hand, clasping this man who had been responsible for so much pain in her life. And she felt that healing warmth and love of God permeating them both. And she said later that she had never felt the power of God's love and forgiveness and healing as she did in that moment. And she was able to say, I forgive you, brother, with all my heart. Her heart was purified through an act of her will. So when we read this passage, actually these are condensed readings. Swami tried very hard to just make them very short. So there's actually a line that I want to talk about at the end of this first little verse. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And the new line is, that you may be the children of God. In other words, if you do these things, then you are truly children of God. You are acting as his instruments. You are being true to that love that he's given you. Then it's not just affirming, oh yeah, we're all children of God. We're living it. We are living as children of God. And that missing verse also says, which I don't have it written down here, it also says, because that you may be children of God, for God makes the sun to shine on the evil and the good. And he sends his rain to shower on the just and the unjust. And it's interesting that it's the sun and the rain that is used in this analogy, because the warmth of the sun and the nourishment of the rain is what makes everything grow on this planet. God gives his effulgence, he gives his grace, he gives his blessings, he gives his love to every creature, every single person, everything alive and sleeping. He gives it all to everyone. But we have to open up to receive it. And the spiritual path, people think, there's only a few people on the spiritual path. Well, everyone is on the spiritual path, whether they know it or not. And the way I think of it is that we all suffer. There's just suffering. I remember a psychic once told me, "Oh my gosh, in your past you cried buckets of tears." And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure that's right." But we cry rivers of tears. There is so much suffering. Why? Because we live in the selfish ego. We think about ourselves. We think, how does anything that happens affect me? What can I get? I need this. I want this. The biggest piece of pie is for me. It's all about me. And then, little by little, we reap the karma of that thought, which is pain and suffering. And after a while, we start to think, this isn't really working. Maybe I could try something different. Maybe my concrete ego doesn't know everything. Let me ask for help. And we cry out from the depths of those rivers of tears, and we say, God, help me. And what does God say? Ask, and it shall be given unto you. Seek, and ye shall find. That prayer goes up, and the ray of light comes right into your life. And maybe it comes as a spiritual book or a movie that's uplifting, a conversation, an experience. Something starts to soften your heart. And little by little, step by step, we experience more joy and more freedom as we walk the spiritual path. The Gita says even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fear and colossal suffering. And this reading talks so much about how to walk the spiritual path. Love God because you see Him in everything. Accept whatever comes as healing strokes of His love. The Bible also says, remember, all things work together for good to those who love God. We just have to open more and more. It's an attunement. If we start accepting everything as the will of God that's coming to us, that doesn't mean not changing for the better, whatever we can change, not trying to grow, not being passive, but by truly trying to do God's will, trying to see God's will, we will be happier and freer in every moment. And that's really the essence of the spiritual path, is to try to tune into God, try to draw His light, try to be one with Him, try to experience, not just affirm, but live in that light. And then share His love with everyone. It's very simple. It's not easy. But that's our job. And we have to have the courage to do it in every moment.
I had a dream last night, and I don't typically sort of wax eloquent about dreams, but this one had an interesting punchline that I will share. This was Nayaswami Devi in the dream, and she gave a piece of advice that I think applies to everyone. She said, she gave me something very, very valuable and very energetic. She gave a gift and she said, "Buck the trend." And I thought, and it was a challenging thought because it was not clear in the dream what the trend was that I was to buck. But then I thought about the service today, because the simple phrase, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." I don't know how many of us in the room have ever said the words, "Nobody's perfect." Anybody ever say those words? I know I have. And it's usually a little bit of an excuse. Well, nobody's perfect after all. Therefore, I'm allowed to be, whatever I am, whatever lower version of self with a small s. And Christ doesn't let us get away with that. Christ says, "Be ye therefore perfect." And I thought to get, and so hence Davies, I wouldn't say command, but strong suggestion, buck the trend. Buck the trend that says, nobody's perfect. Because it's an excuse to say, well, so I don't have to grow into my potential. I can just sort of, work my way down to the lowest common denominator, and that's not what it's about. The example I wanted to share, being around Swamiji was an exercise in trying to embrace more than we were at the time. And he would give suggestions. One of his great gifts in terms of leadership was he would put a goal out there, or he would send out a direction that to us looked impossible. And if we were coming at it sort of from the lower self, our response would be, well, we would list out all the reasons why it'll never work. And he really had no use for that, because that's just a way of saying, well, I don't want to put out the energy. I don't want to try. I don't want to try to be more than I am because it's inconvenient. It's not comfortable. It's a lot more comfortable to just sort of lay in my little personal mud puddle. And so here's an example of this. When we lived in India, Swamiji spent a year and a half writing a course of study called, at the time it was called Material Success Through Yoga Principles. Later on it became Success and Happiness Through Yoga Principles. And after all of this work, he wrote it as a way of helping us support the work that we were developing in India, because all of us just came over there with whatever savings we had. In some cases, people didn't have any savings at all, and it was a little hand to mouth for quite some time there. And so he wrote this course as a way of helping us to support the work, really to build the work. He wanted us to be able to buy land and develop a sort of a proper headquarters, a proper community, etc. And land in India is quite expensive. So he wanted to price this course accordingly. And he said, okay, let's price it at $1,000 for the course, so that people who take it will benefit materially, which they would, of course, and the work itself, the money wasn't for him, the money was to buy land and to develop the work. Well, we were new in India, and we kind of knew intuitively, new work, lots of money involved, relatively unknown Swami. I mean, he was known by some people who had been friends of his for decades, but in terms of the vast numbers of Indians, he was relatively new to the place. It was not a recipe for instant success, and yet intuitively I could understand we have to try. We have to take a step and then another step in the direction of the impossible. And that's what we did. And it was interesting to watch later, because this is a wonderful exercise in introspection. When you advance toward the impossible, often you find that what looks like a barrier, looks like a mountainside that you cannot get over the top of or around the side of or under the bottom of, in reality turns out to be a seeming barrier, and you get closer and closer to it and you realize, oh, I can go around something, or there is a pathway, I just haven't seen it yet. And that's what we discovered with this and so many other situations. We realized there is a way, but it involves embracing something that is unknown to us and stepping out of our comfort zone. And that's what we did. And people definitely benefited from that course and grew. And yes, we did have to gradually adapt our pricing structure, and we did it in groups. I mean, we had all sorts of other ways that we ended up working with it. But if we had just started with the typical, no, it's not going to work, Swami, it's not going to work. I can't yet. What we said was, well, I don't know how it's going to work, but I'm going to try. And perfection is not, we see images behind us of the masters, and it's a kind of an image of perfection, and yet no picture can really capture perfection. We see a murti, like the murti of Master here, or a murti of Buddha, or another master. And there's a feeling captured in it. And yet, how can you contain infinity in an image or in a structure, in an appearance? You can't. Perfection is a process. It's a movement. And it's a movement that comes through us. As Nirmala was saying, we have to open ourselves to that movement. Otherwise, it's like we're asking for the divine river of love and consciousness and energy to move through us, but we're sucking at it with a straw. And yeah, okay, we can get a little bit through that straw, but there's not a whole lot that can come. And these things are universal. These things are beyond our personal preference. I was struck recently by the realization, in the Festival of Light, there's the lovely prayer. Christ gives it in the Bible as a kind of command. Thou shalt love the Lord with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength. We say it as a prayer. We open our hearts, our minds, our souls, and with all our strength we choose thy love. The thought struck me that the paths of yoga align exactly with that prayer. With all my heart, the path of bhakti yoga. With all my mind, the path of jnana yoga. With all my soul, the path of raja yoga. With all my strength, the path of karma yoga. Every one of us has different variations of those same qualities in ourselves. And we all have the means to move forward toward that perfection based on our own strengths, based on our own inclinations. And whether we embrace the prayer from the Bible, whether we accept it from the Hindu or the Indian or the Vedantic tradition, or whether it comes from some other tradition, it is universal. And it is now. It is present in this moment and in this room and in each of our hearts. And is it easy? No. As Nirmala pointed out, it is challenging. It may be simple, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. In watching Swamiji move through the world, move through life, one of the sterling qualities that I was aware of was, in fact, simplicity. And here was someone who sprouted projects and artistic ventures and creative. We used to think he could launch an army before breakfast. You know, we would sometimes come back from morning sadhana, and he would just be fizzing with ideas. I mean, we hadn't even sat down to breakfast yet, and he was all ready to, you know, get a new initiative going here and there and someplace else. And that was just the divine moving through him. And you would think, perhaps you would think, I know I thought, well, my gosh, if you're going to have so many projects, if you're going to have so much creativity moving through you, surely there's going to be attachment and there's going to be a kind of thinning out of energy. I don't know how it is for you, but I know if too many projects are going, I feel like one of these little, you know, crepe batter, when you pour it on the griddle, you know, it spreads out. If you've ever seen a dosa, masala dosa, you know, sometimes they make these things that are like 3 feet wide. It's all one batter, you know, it spreads out, but it's paper thin. I mean, it's like a piece of paper when it's rolled up. Sometimes you feel like you're thinned out that way. And yet Swamiji could be perfectly simple. And how did he do it? He did it by being right in this moment and by focusing on one thing. In Nirmala's story about Corrie ten Boom, she had the person in front of her to greet and to give God's love to. And yes, at one point in the process, that person turned out to be a very challenging person to greet. Oh, Mr. Prison Guard, you too are coming. You too are asking for God's forgiveness. Can I give it as a human being? No, I cannot. As a human being, it's beyond my capacity to give that forgiveness. But if I reach my hand out, or in the case of the yogic path, if I reach my meditation up, if I reach my posture forward, if I take a deep breath, if I open my heart to a chant or an affirmation. This affirmation is so lovely today. This is the expression of courage, because that's what it takes to do that act of transcendence. We have to have courage. Courage is not never being challenged. It's not never feeling fear. Courage is saying, I'm still going to do something, even if what I do lands me on my nose, even if what I do isn't perfect according to my human definition of it. At least I'm going to try. At least I'm going to put out the effort to go up somehow. And that effort leads to perfection and leads to greater and greater and greater attunement. And that blessing is for all of us. Let us never think, and it's not just for all of us here in the room, we precious few, it's for this entire world, because as Nirmala pointed out, everyone is on the spiritual path. Yes, our little minds like to neatly divide people into categories and groups and, you know, this group and that group and, those people over there, those horrible people. All of us have that little way. It's human nature. But everybody wants something more. We just have to learn to raise our energy up in order to receive it. There's a line in the Bible that I have often been inspired by, and it's talking about giving to God. And the line is, he will open up the windows, I'm going to have to paraphrase, open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing such that there will not be room enough to receive it. So we have to do our part in that process of creating enough room to receive it. Recently I flew over Lake Tahoe and noticed, with the snow-covered mountains, the lake is full to the brim. Wow, what a concept. It's like it comes right to the mountains. There's just lake and mountain. We have to make ourselves ready to receive an ocean of blessing. And it may come to us in challenging ways, like it did with Corrie ten Boom. But by that opening, we can receive it, and a miracle can happen, or miracles can happen. And we never know how and when, by whom, through whom that will come. But come it will when we open our hearts.